Good morning. We are here to discuss Parshas Emor, which is just now this year, the second to last week that we will be in the book, in the Sefer of Vayikra, Leviticus, and Parshas Emor deals with many laws of the Kohanim, as we will shortly discuss, and also another very interesting section, which will be the subject of our conversation. The title for today's class is Saving Ourselves from Ourselves. This month, the month of Iyar, sponsored by the Slomiansky family, in loving memory of Daniel ben Yaakov Halevi Zichrono Livracha, and we definitely wish the family should have total nechama, and the neshama should have an aliyah. We thank them for continuing to commemorate this very important date with us. This week's class is also dedicated to all members of K'lal Yisrael suffering pain and hardships, and for the merit of a Refu'ah Sh'leima for Yisroel Ben Rochel, Meir ben Ruth, Chaim Yitzchak ben Chaya B'racha, Yidel Ben Rochel, Moshe David ben Rochel, Sonayela Basya bas Yehudis Rus, Levi Yitzchok Isaac ben Orah Yutel, and Avraham Shmuel ben Kreindel Yehudit. Many of these people are dear friends or relatives of our attendees. We definitely wish them a complete, speedy Refu'ah Sh'leima. Even though complete and Shleima means the same thing, we just want everything to be as healed as Hashem will provide very quickly among all K'lal Yisrael and deserving people. This week's class is also sponsored in honor of Jonathan Slomiansky's birthday. Mazel tov. Very exciting always to commemorate that special event in the Slomiansky family as well. Jonathan should have tremendous bracha and hatzlacha and find all that he is looking for. And in his quest for spirituality and serving Hashem, he should be totally successful. So, title, Saving Ourselves from Ourselves. As a basic introduction to today's discussion, I would like to posit that many of us, and indeed probably most of us, struggle with some form of self-destructive behaviors. Simple examples are significant overeating, not maintaining our bodies properly in terms of strength conditioning, mobility, and flexibility, or simply not brushing or flossing our teeth adequately, as I sit in front of Dr. Rothman. Arguably, even more important self-destructive tendencies that we ought to consider are wasting time, relationship sabotaging, and tons of addictive behaviors. I decided today to do a little search. So of course I asked ChatGPT a simple question. What percentage of people are self-destructive? And the basic answer, which I'll give you a short summary of in a second, is that there's no single universally agreed upon percentage of people who are self-destructive, because it really does depend on how you define self-destructive. But here's a few important perspectives on the psychological research. Number one type that we're discussing is clinical self-destructive behaviors. For example, self-harm and substance abuse. Those are extremely real and damaging self-destructive behaviors. Percentage is there, believe it or not, and we're talking about non-suicidal self-injury, is 4 to 6% of adults, which to me is alarmingly high, even though it's quote unquote only 4 to 6%. When we're talking about hundreds of millions or billions of people, that's a lot of people. Substance abuse disorders, much higher, with around 16%, that's 16% of the population aged 12 or older, substance abuse. And then suicide attempts, which we're not even going to talk about, also is a 12%. Subtle, or that's one category, right? So real damaging, self-destructive, self-harm, substance abuse types of behaviors. Second one, meaning the second category, is either subtle or indirect self-destructive behaviors. And this includes things like sabotaging relationships, procrastinating important tasks. Anybody familiar with that one? Procrastinating important tasks. Avoiding success or engaging in risky lifestyles. People might not think that not paying their back taxes is engaging in risky behavior, but it is. So research suggests that up to 70 or 80%, 70 or 80% of people may engage in self-handicapping, like creating obstacles to success type behaviors. And so the summary is 4 to 20% engage in either clinical or overt self-destructive behaviors, and possibly 50% or much higher engage in subtler, often unconscious, self-destructive behaviors at times. So as we now move closer to the end of Sefer Vayikra, it is important to note that the vast majority of the subject matter of Sefer Vayikra relates to offerings and kohanim, the laws of ritual impurity, morality versus immorality, kosher versus non-kosher species of wildlife, animal, fish, etc. And so now what we're going to point out is that the end of Parshas Emor is indeed quite anomalous. Seems like it does not belong here in Sefer Vayikra at all. And from that contrast, we are going to build a premise regarding self-destructive behaviors and what we can do to help ourselves to not be involved in these types of self-destructive behaviors, which such a large percentage of the world is currently involved with in various ways, some of them extremely, extremely dangerous physically, and some of them even horribly dangerous emotionally, spiritually, and psychologically. So here's the contrast. The beginning of Parshas Emor describes the special sanctity of Kohanim, followed by the holidays and the lighting of the menorah. And then we have very interesting that the Torah puts here the lighting of the menorah and the showbread table. That's basically most of Parshas Emor. Then at the end, the Torah seems to wildly digress to recount the highly, highly disturbing episode of a Jewish man that publicly curses Hashem, publicly, in a very egregious way. The way the Talmud describes that kind of curse, by the way, is where a person says that God should cancel himself out of existence. Terrible, terrible. And he does that in public. Now, in addition to that episode, which the Torah does do some description in recounting, the Torah then informs us that this man must be stoned to death. And then the Torah writes several verses regarding a person that murders, a person kills an animal, or injures another person, or damages an animal. Now, interesting, there's also a rabbinic exegesis, right, a derivation that we learn that if a person strikes their parent and wounds them, that it too is a capital crime. And that's also learned here from the end of the parsha. So the obvious question is, how can we possibly understand why these laws are located here towards the end of Sefer Vayikra in general? What does murdering another person or damaging an animal or one's parent, what does that have to do with the overall theme of the Kohanim, ritual impurity, immorality versus immorality? What's it doing here? And specifically now, at the end of our parsha, Parshas Emor, the Torah juxtaposes the law of one who curses Hashem with murder and damaging a person or an animal. Like, what does that have to do with anything? And it's literally in the same exact paragraph in the Torah, and it's just bizarre. Now, later I'm going to mention a fascinating commentary, one of really my favorite sefer on Chumash of all time, but we'll discuss that later. So let's now discuss, or look, I should say, carefully at the beginning of the Parsha. And the Parsha begins here in Parshas Emor with a general admonition that the Kohanim are not allowed to become ritually unclean and therefore come in contact with dead people. So they're not allowed to become unclean in terms of coming in contact with dead people. Now, there are exceptions. Immediate family members for all Kohanim is not only allowed, but it's the right thing to do. And there's a couple other exceptions that we don't need to get into now. And that's true by Kohanim, regular, what we call the regular priestly caste, are prohibited to come in contact with most corpses, but immediate family members, they are, yes, allowed. Now, the high priest is not allowed to come in contact even with his immediate family members, even though he has an exception. The exception does not apply for immediate family members. In addition to that, the Torah teaches us that this set of restrictions should be taught by the older Kohanim to the young Kohanim. That means that the older Kohanim should go out of their way to make sure that the younger Kohanim understand these rules. And that's a very interesting requirement, because typically speaking, we rely on the fact that, number one, a person has their own obligation to study Torah, and number two, we rely on the fact that there are, thank God, and have always been teachers for the Jewish people who teach Torah to the next generation. We don't normally talk about any specific group of Jewish male adults as being responsible to teach the next specific, their descendants, other than the general, that a father should teach a son. So that's very interesting unto itself. Now, in addition to those laws of sanctification, the Torah also mentions that regular Jews have an obligation to give respect and therefore special recognition to the sanctity of the Kohen, and therefore the Kohen gets called up first to the Torah, the Kohen gets special portions, and the Kohen is very often asked to lead the Torah discussion or other conversations. They are given that level of respect. Aside from that, the Torah then tells us who a Kohen is yes allowed to marry and who a Kohen is not allowed to marry, and similar with a high priest Kohen. And then on top of that, the Torah then talks about special rules of blemishes, that if a Kohen has physical blemishes, depending on what type they have, they may be disqualified from service. And then the Torah does a similar thing about which types of animals are allowed. And bottom line, the Torah then proceeds to discuss holidays primarily. Okay, so all of this is towards the beginning of Parshas Emor. What I'd like to do is draw your attention to what I consider a really interesting comment by Baal HaTurim, Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal HaTurim, who writes the following idea. He says, if you'll notice, this Parsha, Parshas Emor, which starts with these laws that a Kohen is not allowed to come in contact with corpses, generally speaking, and who he is yes allowed to marry, not allowed to marry, etc. These laws are placed right next to the sentence of last week's Parsha, which tells us that when a man will seek wizardry and to divine the future through the Ov or the Yidel, certain type of necromancing practices, whereby people will take bones of dead people or whatever they would use, and some medium, some person claiming to get information from these bones would then predict the future and prognosticate. That's a capital crime. That's the way last week's Parsha concludes. So says the Baal HaTurim that the Torah is telling us here, don't look for those practices that secular or other peoples of the world look towards in order to determine the future. We have Kohanim, and a Kohen, especially the high priest, we know, has this thing called the Urim V'Tumim. It's a mechanism based on the vestments of the high priest, that a person would go to the Kohen and ask them particular questions about the future, and letters on the breastplate of the stones of these precious gems of the breastplate of the high priest would light up, and that would indicate the answer as to what will yes or not happen in the future. So the Baal HaTurim is saying that the reason the Torah puts these things together, the necromancer next to the Kohen, is to tell us, look, we need to look towards the Kohen if we want that kind of information, and not the practices of other peoples that they call wizardry or necromancy. Now, the obvious difficulty with that comment is that it's true the Torah puts together necromancy and the Kohen, but we have other sentences in the Torah back in Exodus and Shemos that tell us of this mechanism called the Urim V'Tumim, which allows for the question to be asked of the high priest and for the letters to give the answer, and for a person to then be, aware, become knowledgeable of the future. But that's not mentioned over here. So it's really hard to understand what in the world the concept of putting necromancy next to these laws of the Kohanim is supposed to teach us in terms of this idea that you go to the Kohen to look towards the future, when in fact, it's not mentioned here that the Kohen does this. More than that, Rabbi Chil is, pointing out an important question also, and that is that really those questions were really only for the public. They were not private questions. So, everybody's favorite question is lottery numbers on Sunday, what are they for me? Would not be an appropriate question to ask the Urim V'Tumim, the high priest. If the Jewish people should go to war or not, that's a matter of the public. That would, yes, be an appropriate question. So, it just doesn't match because, as much as people want to know about taking a war in Iran, a lot of people also want to know about lottery numbers, and they can't go ask that question. So that's another problem with this idea of what are we supposed to take from it, that we can, yes, ask these questions, when in fact there's many questions that we cannot ask about the future when we go to a Kohen. And I think that we're going to propose an answer to that, but also I would ask is that you can't go to any Kohen, you can only go to one Kohen. And so it's not like, the laws of the Kohanim in general should be part of this idea. The laws of the Kohen Gadol at most should be part of this idea, not the laws of the Kohen in general. Okay, so those are some other questions. So what I'd like to do is propose an answer to this question that hopefully will actually, you know what? I'm not going to start with the answer to this question. We'll come back to the answer to this question. First, let's go back to the story of the blasphemer. And let me just read to you a couple of sentences from there. And then I'll tell you this beautiful idea that is proposed by the Ma'aseh Hashem. His name is Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi of the 1500s. And he was purportedly a study partner of the following three famous great rabbis, the Shulchan Aruch, everybody's heard of him, Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Ramah, Rabbi Moshe Isserlis, and the Maharal. Supposedly, he studied with all three of these giants, and then he wrote this somewhat known sefer, but it's not so well known, called Ma'aseh Hashem. He also wrote a commentary to the Book of Esther. Very, very fascinating commentator in person. If anybody's interested, I'll explain why my family has a special connection to this person a different time. So the Torah tells us, after it mentions the law of lighting the candles of the menorah and the showbread of the table, the Torah tells us that there was a son of a Jewish woman who was also the son of an Egyptian man. So his father is Egyptian, his mother is Jewish. He went out among the Jewish people. They fought in the camp, the son of this Jewish woman and a different Jewish man. And then the Torah says, this son of the Jewish woman cursed the divine name of God. He blasphemed. They brought this person to Moshe, and then it tells us the name of his mother, which we're not going to get into today. They put him in jail until it would be explained to them by Hashem what to do with this person. The next paragraph says, Hashem said to Moshe, take out this curser, this blasphemer, outside the camp. Anybody who heard him curse should put their hands on his head, or at least two witnesses, and stone him. The whole congregation should stone him. And to the Jewish people, you should admonish them and say, anybody who curses his God will bear his sin. And anybody who curses God will have death as their punishment. They will be stoned by the whole congregation. This is true by every Jewish person or convert. If they curse the name of God, they will die. And then randomly, seemingly, the Torah tells us, by the way, anybody who murders a person, he will die. Anybody who strikes an animal and damages it has to pay for it. And if he kills it, he has to pay the whole value of the animal. Or if a person injures another friend, a friend of his, or another member of the nation, he also has to suffer for what he did. This is where we talk about a broken bone for a broken bone, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. This is one of the places in the Torah. Whatever blemish he gave, that's what should be given to him. Now, of course, the rabbis understand that this refers to paying for it, not to actually giving them an eye for an eye. And that's the way we always practiced these laws ever since they were first given at Sinai. It means monetary payment. And then it says that a person who strikes an animal, strikes a person, has to suffer for it, and in fact, even should die. Over here, the rabbis tell us that this refers to hitting a parent, causing them a wound. That's a capital crime. And then the Torah finally concludes that they stoned this person to death. So it's a wild mix of ideas, as I mentioned in our opening. How do we understand what all of this is doing here? So I want to share with you this idea that I saw this week, and I absolutely love it. And from there, we're going to build the rest of our class. The Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi, in his Sefer Ma'aseh Hashem, posits the following, and he makes an excellent point. He says, why do we need to know that they were fighting and that's why the person blasphemed? Seemingly, what we need to know is that a person who curses, a person who blasphemes God, needs to be stoned to death. And the people who heard him, they put their hands on him, etc. Why do we need to know that there was a precipitating fight before he blasphemed? So this rabbi, Rabbi Eliezer Ashkenazi, in the Maaseh Hashem, explains that the lesson here in the Torah is the evils of anger. This is what happens when people get angry. And he goes on to explain that the reason the Torah tells us about the fight is because it's telling us that this person who got angry, he lost his mind, which means he literally went crazy, which is what the rabbis tell us about anger, which is why the rabbis tell us over here that he went out, means that he left his world. He literally lost touch with reality. And because of that, he does one of the most horrific things that any human being could ever do, to curse the very existence of God. And then he explains further that that's why the Torah then goes on to tell us all these other laws. Because the Torah tells us that if you allow your anger to get a hold of you, you will do destructive things. You will damage animals. You might even kill animals. You will damage people. You might even kill people. You will hit your parents and you might wound them. And some of these things are a capital crime, and some of them you have to pay for. But you know why you did these things? Because you got angry. That's why. That's what this rabbi says, which I think is just a fabulous idea. But now let's actually build it here further and then into the rest of the parsha. Okay, there's many ways the Torah could have taught us about anger. The Torah could have said, don't get angry. Shlomo HaMelech writes about this very explicitly in beautiful ways, that, and in fact, Nachmanides, or the author of the Ramban's letter, when he writes to his son, he tells us right away that anger is the root of all evils, and he quotes a sentence which says, remove anger from your flesh. Why does the Torah choose to tell us about anger with a person who blasphemes God? So I would like to suggest that cursing God is the ultimate, and I think I'm going to surprise you here, act not of hurting God, but of hurting oneself. It's the ultimate act of self-destruction. Because even a person who commits suicide, which most people look at the ultimate act of self-destruction, they leave open the possibility that they may be connected to God. Now, fascinatingly, the rabbis teach us that there are types of people who are angry at God, and therefore they're choosing to end their life as a slap in the face to God. That would, yes, be very similar to blaspheming God. But even blaspheming God is more direct even than that, because when a person blasphemes God, they're saying, God, be canceled out of existence. Well, guess what happens? If you cancel God out of existence, everything disappears. The person themselves and the entire universe. Now, obviously, it can't happen. At a different time, we can discuss how even God can't do that, which is a fascinating discussion. But the bottom line is that's what the person is doing in his mind and as much as he can, and therefore he becomes completely canceled out of existence. That's what happens to this person. Why? Because he gets angry. So why, when a person gets angry, do they become self-destructive? The answer is because really they're angry at themselves and they can't stand themselves. They don't respect themselves and they don't believe in themselves and they don't want to feel their own existence. Now, before it gets to that extreme, a person will think that they can feel their existence much better if they could just do whatever they want, which we're going to get into in a moment. But the real depth of anger is that a person is angry with themselves and they are willing to be completely destructive because they don't have hope for their own future. Because nobody has ever done anything in anger that was constructive. It's always destructive. We've given other classes on this if anybody wants. I'll be happy to send them a whole different share on anger. That's not the main point that I want to get to today, but it's an important foundation to understand what happens when a person gets angry. It's not only they become destructive, they become self-destructive. That's what happens. So we understand very well, as per Ma'aseh Hashem Rav Eliezer Ashkenazi, that the end of the Parsha is teaching us about what happens when a person becomes completely self-destructive. They could go from damaging an animal to murdering a person to, God forbid, cursing God. By the way, in Talmudic parlance, we never even talk about cursing God because it's such a bad concept. We talk about blessing Hashem as a euphemism for cursing him. Just be aware how much it's, we have an apathy towards, an antipathy towards that concept. So we don't even talk about cursing. We say blessing as a euphemism. So my suggestion is this. We saw the statistics on how many people become self-destructive. Why? Why are people becoming so self-destructive? Why? It's a crazy, crazy amount. I was speaking to my friend Joseph Rackman this morning. He said he was really shocked to hear how high the percentages are. And so here's my suggestion. The human tendency towards self-destructive behavior is that it represents an acceptance of a person's low nature and or abilities. And my father explains that this is why people are very into cursing. Because, and when I mean cursing over here, I'm not talking about cursing other people, I'm talking about using language that are cursed words, like epithets. All of that, says my father, because a person is engaging in their lower animalistic side, which is why it's always about either the grotesque body parts or that which the body excretes as grotesque body parts, or the lowest form of human relations, right? Those are all the negative words because it's just saying, I'm an animal. And we're in the literal manure with the pigs. When a person does that, they do that because they are accepting the low nature of themselves, and then they relieve the responsibility of being anything better than that, of being above that and rising above. They completely take away the need to do better because I'm an animal. Those are my tendencies. Now, fascinatingly, in the world of education, we have a huge issue where educators are noticing that students have much less what we used to call perseverance or determination to overcome challenges. In today's jargon, that's called resilience and grit. So the idea that a human being should be resilient and overcome challenges and tough it out through difficult moments, that's a much lost art among our younger generations. And educators are noticing this, everything from concentration to just studying for a test. No, it's hard. I can't do that. I don't do that. And what I'm saying to this is that the Torah is coming specifically to address how a person abdicates to their lower selves, how a person relieves themselves of responsibility by engaging in the more animalistic side or in the actual self-destructive behaviors which self-validate, that's who I am. This is what I do. And therefore I don't have responsibility to persevere and overcome challenge. I don't have to be resilient or exercise and act with grit. And over here, the Torah is teaching us a brilliant insight in how to tackle this problem. And it's so important for all of us, for ourselves, for our families, and for educators. It's just phenomenally important. here's my suggestion. In order for a person to persevere and fight, to overcome challenges, they must know themselves, who they really are, and their potential, and their ability to elevate and attain spirituality and holiness. A person must be made aware of who they really are, know that about themselves, understand their potential and their ability to grow and attain spirituality and holiness. And this is why the Torah so aptly describes how not only does the Kohen need to be aware of to whom he can become in contact with dead people, and which dead people, and whom he can marry or not marry, and what their physical readiness and appropriate needs to be for service to Hashem. But the Torah also says that the older Kohanim, the parents, the older generation, needs to teach the younger generation what their uniqueness is, what their holiness, what their potential is, who they are. And that's a message that needs to come from people who have taken upon themselves that level of perseverance and growth to be true to their potential, like the older generation of the Kohanim. And it's also necessary for the whole community to acknowledge that about the Kohen, so that the Kohen knows who he is. We're going to talk about more about that in a second. So the point is that the Torah is telling us, very, very fascinating thing. If you want a Kohen to be super special and who they're meant to be, including that the high priest will be a vehicle, an oracle of predicting the future, the Kohen needs to know who they are, and the Jews need to know who a Kohen is, and they need to act with that level of self-awareness and sanctity and morality, and build their lives with the right relationships and serve Hashem appropriately, understand their role in that. And the whole community needs to know that, because otherwise the Kohen Gadol will not become that person. And the level of teaching and the level of inspiration that all Kohanim are supposed to serve to the Jewish people is only if the Kohen knows who he is and the Jew knows who a Kohen is. And the same is true by the Jews themselves. And as we know, we've mentioned here many times, the Jewish people are themselves the Kohanim of the world. And nobody, right? That's what Hashem says. You will be my treasured nation. You will be for me a kingdom of Kohanim. That applies to all Jewish people. And the special sanctity and the special morality of the Jewish people, and what we can eat and what we cannot eat, and whom we can marry and whom we cannot marry, and how we have to be prepared for bringing offerings and to be pure. All of that. That's what the whole Sefer Vayikra is about. We have to understand who we are and our special mission in this world and the way that we can connect to Hashem. And if we don't know that, then of course we're going to descend into the depravity of the nations of the world and their immoral behaviors and the necromancing that they do. Of course, we're going to abdicate our special selves. We're going to be good. We're just like everyone else. And then we will lose all of that potential and all of that holiness, and we will become totally self-destructive and blasphemous. That's the connection in the Parsha between the beginning and the end of the Parsha. But along the way, the Torah says very brilliantly, understand that part of the Jewish people, not part of the Kohanim, part of the Jewish people are the Kohanim. That's part of our community. We are privileged to have the Kohen, and the Kohen and his holiness and his ability to help us, including prognostication. All of that depends on the whole Jewish people. It depends on the older Kohanim teaching the younger Kohanim. It depends on the Jews giving them special sanctification. It depends on everybody preserving the holiness of the temple and understanding what a sacrifice is and what a sacrifice cannot be. And it also means that the Jewish people themselves need to understand what the holidays are, because the holidays are the opportunity for every Jew to expand their spiritual ability and their greatness by connecting to Hashem through these holidays in all the fascinating ways that the holidays do for us. Of course, now we're counting the Emor specifically to grow in this level of holiness, which is also, of course, mentioned in our Parsha. So the special sanctity of all the Jewish people and all the levels that the Jewish people can achieve through the holidays. Plus, let's just look what happens when holiness and spirituality meets physicality. The light of the menorah never goes out. It's always there because we've attained a level of connection to the Kohen and to the Holy Temple, and Hashem is with us, so the light never goes out. And the bread, the showbread, which is 8 days old always before a Kohen can eat it, is fresh like the moment it came out of the oven. That's what happens when spirituality meets physicality, and that's a capability of all the Jews. But it depends on us knowing who we are, preserving all the treasures of our community, including the Kohanim, and then we can reap both the spiritual and material benefits of that. But if, God forbid, we Jews start fighting with each other, we start imagining that we should be a Kohen, or we belong in that tribe, or we belong in a different, group that is not really our role, and then we start fighting with each other, so we disconnect from each other. We can go from the pinnacle of spirituality and attainment and wholeness with each other to blaspheming God. And as the Maaseh Hashem says, when we give into anger, that is the pathway. That is what will happen. That's why it's exactly part of the same paragraph. What happens with anger is we become destructive and self-destructive. But the way to help, this is the critical piece here, and I actually want to share with you, somebody sent me this today. I think it's also relevant. Just give me a second. The way to help ourselves, to help our next generation in terms of self-esteem and self-awareness, and this is very important, is that we have to explain to all Jews, right? To ourselves, to the next generation, if we teach, etc., our family, that this quality of uniqueness and special role in the world, which relates to a rarefied spirituality, demands a rigor in the physical world as well. It demands self-discipline. It demands a commitment to doing the hard things. That's grit and resilience. Now, my father always, points out how difficult it is for people to be different than other people. And it's one of his, such a hallmark teaching of his, that specifically the Kohanim need to know that, that despite their being asked for themselves to be different even than the rest of the Jewish people, that is a special responsibility and therefore a special attainment that they can also have. Of course, the same is true for Jews. But I'm focusing more just on the notion that if we don't live up to our true identity of greatness, then we very much desire self-destruction, because then we can anesthetize ourselves, we can deny that part of ourselves, we can make pretend that we don't have responsibility or obligation by escaping from it, and then we're truly angry at ourselves, and then of course it descends from there, as we've already described. So one major way to really help ourselves and help people is to make sure that we are positive thinking and positively communicating about the special qualities that we see in each other and in our children. So we tend to hyper-focus on everything that other people do wrong. And often, if we're not so self-destructive, then we, hyper-focus on our good qualities and not on our bad qualities. But the real goal is to be very realistic about everybody's abilities, everybody's potential, and to be positively communicating how meaningful and helpful other people's contributions are and things that they already do, not as a way of putting pressure, but simply as a way of acknowledging and giving them the correct space. So one of the things that I want to conclude with is one of the terrible things that we've accepted as far as I'm concerned in secular society, and probably not that many people will agree with me, is that we've taken on this idea that people acquire nicknames or acquire more casual labels, and we become very comfortable in casting them about, whether it's going from, let's just take an example, a formal name Yitzchak to Yitzi. it's automatically less formal. Now, I'm not saying that that's the most horrible thing in the world, but I do think we have to be extremely sensitive to the fact that what we call other people, they will often see themselves that way. And somebody's supposed to be called sir or rabbi or Mr. or Rebbitzin. It's very important that we give the right acknowledgement because, first of all, they need to be reminded to see themselves that way. They also need to be given that kind of correct role so that they can be the person who they need to be. That's a very important aspect that we're discussing here today, that we need to know who the Kohen is, just like the Kohen needs to know who the Kohen is, which is why we have to be very careful how we treat a Kohen. But ergo, we should learn very careful how we treat everybody in their individual role with the right respect. And that's why labeling someone or giving them a nickname, of course, that's demeaning, is absolutely horrible, horrible, horrible. But I'm saying let's go to the opposite side and say, what's the right role? How do we give the person the right title and respect that is suited for who they are? And then the last thing I want to share, and my friend Richard Saka actually texted me this today, and I think it's so nice that that we be aware of this, of what the Rabbeinu Yonah writes, and it's related to many of the parshios here in Sefer Vayikra, and it says from Igeres HaTeshuva Rabbeinu Yonah, I think it's 41, we are required to appoint individuals to promote peace between spouses and between fellow men. The appointees should be happy individuals who know how to placate and appease people and bring peace among them. My point is that the Jewish people always sought to build people up, to bring relationships and people together. And that's what really we say in davening. We say, V'yoatzenu k'bat tefillah, Hashem should return to us our counselors like we always had at the beginning. We need people to promote positive, healthy self-image and positive and healthy relationships. That's the opposite of what happens with the blasphemer. And the only way to get there is if we're also focused on the potential that we have, as well as making sure that we are staying away from anger and monitoring our own self-destructive tendencies. And just know that if you're engaging in self-destructive behavior of any kind, of which possibly 70 or 80% of people are doing, it's because you're not happy with yourself and you're angry at yourself, which means that you're not demanding from yourself the greatness that you can be. Let's do any questions or comments, please. Thank you, Rhoda.
Thanks, Akiva. See you next week.
Great, thank you. I'm just giving everybody a minute in case anybody has. Yeah, so Rabbi Chil, just to go back to your question, that the mechanism of the Urim V'Tumim was only for the public, I really think that that's just an example, right? So it's true that it was only for the public, but it's part of a much larger question of what kind of questions should we know. But my answer is ultimately going to be that the better relationships that as a whole individuals have with Kohanim, the better they're going to understand who they need to become and what they should do, regardless of a specific prognostication ability. Much more work needs to be done on that, and we've spoken about it several times. It's not the day to go today, but another time. Okay, thank you. Question in the room. Yes, I believe my father is giving shir today at 10:30. My mother is acknowledging yes, so that's awesome. So please remember to zoom over to my father at 10:30. Dr. Rothman?
Ask about, once you start believing in yourself, it's so hard not to go to a narcissistic, egotistical evaluation of yourself.
Yeah, so
that's so prevalent in our society.
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I'll just mention a brief response. So Dr. Rothman is asking, people who quote unquote have a healthy self-image or ego, that's sometimes a tongue-in-cheek way of saying that they are a little narcissistic or have hubris, right? So how do we have healthy self-image and not become arrogant? And really, in the letter to his son, in the Ramban's letter, he writes that the way to not go to arrogance is to understand that all qualities are given to a person from Hashem, and that they are ultimately meant to serve, not to rule. and ultimately for the honor of Hashem, and that there's something that we all need to learn from everyone, because every person is greater than every person in some way. So there is no blanket, one person is better than. It's every person has greatness, and it's all about a gift from Hashem and learning to serve. Okay, thank you all. Have a super day, everyone.